Okay, welcome everyone. We're here to have a friendly debate between students from SAS and ACJC. The motion, I forget, what's the wording of the motion again? Could someone tell me?
This House believes the response to global pandemic should be led by the World Health Organization rather than individual governments.
Okay, so having said that, I'd like to invite the first speaker of the proposition to come up and open up her team's case. Isha, whenever you're ready.
Good evening. I'm the first speaker of the proposition team, and today we will prove that the World Health Organization should lead the response to global pandemics rather than individual governments. As we have observed, when countries are left to formulate their own pandemic plans, they are made considering what is best for them at the forefront and not what is best for the world as a whole. Their solutions will consider their own needs first, but this can actually be counterproductive to their own fight. Our fight against COVID, for example, has had countries with different strategies of defending themselves against the pandemic. Some opposed lockdown with their economies in mind, aiming for herd immunity. Others imposed lockdown almost immediately. The countries that did not take the initiative of lockdown allowed the virus to spread internationally. This mentality of having countries' personal interests in mind is what allowed the pandemic to become what it is now. While later there was a more coordinated approach where most countries decided on an international lockdown, it was already too late. We are going to give you the 3 reasons on why WHO is better positioned to tackle this global threat. The first is that WHO provides a unified and standardized response to pandemics. The second is that WHO provides more equity than individual governments. And the final reason is that healthcare is the World Health Organization's only concern. The World Health Organization is a specialized agency of the United Nations responsible for international health. Their core function is to direct international health through collaboration. A standardized response would be consistency in the ways each country dealt with the virus. This means all countries would use similar methods at the same time to show a unified front against the virus. To win this debate, the opposition team must prove that having individual governments handle the pandemic can ensure equity in the distribution of vaccines and information. It is important to note that the people that are affected when pandemics are not handled appropriately are the entire global population. The most vulnerable stakeholders are the countries without financial stability. These countries are going to be most affected by the pandemics. The thesis of this argument is that global pandemics should be led by
Bunch of
the
information.
no, thank you. As they can provide a standardized response to a pandemic that every country can follow. Firstly, why do we need a universally standardized response during the pandemic? During the current pandemic, countries are really only caring about what is the best course of action for them moving forward. The root of this issue comes from the different ways countries are approaching the pandemic. We have seen several different methods, which have been initiated at different time periods. However, because the countries were not unified in their handling of the virus, they allowed the virus to spread internationally, and this resulted in the infections of over 94 million people and the deaths of over 2 million people. These deaths and the lingering costs to the people and the economy could have been mitigated better if there was a worldwide health agency coordinating these efforts. To put this into perspective, I'm going to use COVID-19 as an example. The overall goal of the response plan in the beginning of 2020 was to stop further transmission of COVID within China to other countries to mitigate the impact of the outbreak. However, because countries had different reactions to the virus, COVID spread to other countries, and that's where the outbreak really began. So why is WHO uniquely positioned to be the global health agency? WHO is an organization with the information and resources available to provide all countries with a set of basic guidelines they can follow in case of a pandemic. The health of the world's population is their top and only priority, and they've been dealing with similar situations for over 70 years. This means that they had the experience to create a standardized set of regulations that every country can implement, so there is a base standard of safety and security in every nation. Why do countries collaborating matter? Countries collaborating would look like them sharing statistics summarizing how their own country is dealing with the virus. It is important to pull data from the globe into a centralized health agency as it will curb the problem quickly. All countries will be using the same response and will be able to focus on their own people rather than worrying about the virus spreading as a cause of the other countries not having a good way to deal with the pandemic. Why would having a centralized health system be better than individual governments? Global pandemics are exactly what they seem to be, global. This means that its enormity would be too much for countries to face on their own. Because it is a global issue, we need an organization like WHO that can use its extensive database and global connections to lead us. We need to see that the whole world is battling against pandemics and that we need WHO to help us win the fight, not just locally, but internationally as well. An example of how WHO has provided a standardized response in the past is with smallpox. Smallpox was one of the most devastating diseases known to humanity as it caused millions of deaths before it was eradicated. It existed for over 3,000 years and was only eradicated in 1967 when WHO launched an intensified plan. Widespread immunization and surveillance was conducted around the world for several years, and only then was it completely eradicated. This is an extremely profound public health success that shows that it is crucial for countries to collaborate in order to fight pandemics. A global crisis like no other needs a global response like no other. The World Health Organization can provide a global response that can lead countries to better address pandemics. Thank you.
Okay, speaker spoke for 5 minutes and 42 seconds. We'd like to thank her for the speech. ACJC, I'll give you 1 minute, okay? So maybe 1 minute between speakers for everybody today, which isn't usually what we do, but I can give it to you. Just a friendly reminder, make sure you do your POIs loud enough. Also, I think it would be okay if the speaker broke off their speech if they hadn't heard a POI and asked for one. Okay, this is a practice, so we want to hear some POIs. And definitely that keeps everyone fresh and on their toes. Okay. I'd like to invite the first speaker for ACJC to come up and open her team's case. Whenever you're ready, please keep your own time, but I'll keep time here. Who's the first speaker?
It's me. Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll start my speech shortly.
Okay.
Our stance for today is that we support individual governments leading the global pandemic according to specific policies and regulations that they think will best suit each country's situation. So we see that it has no interference with other organizations like WHO. However, we do see that if individual governments wish to consult WHO, they can do so. And we see that this is much different compared to WHO taking the lead, because on our side, the individual governments have the final say and it's up to their individual discretions. So let's move on to characterization, right? We see that WHO is an organization that has advised countries in managing past health crises and outbreaks. For example, smallpox or SARS. The thing about WHO is that the annual operations budget is very highly dependent on funding that they have received in the past from different countries, for example, the China or the US. For example, in 2019, their budget was $2 billion USD, and this can be directly compared to the US budget, which was $95 billion. So we see that since the WHO's budget is significantly smaller compared to individual governments' budget, they are solely focused on providing medical aid, and they're not really focused on other things such as doing research in the country and finding out their culture. So what are the big questions for the House today? Number one, which side has the best policies to end the pandemic? And number two, is WHO really effective in ending the pandemic? So what are our substantives today? My first substantive will be on how individual governments are in the best position to make policies. My second substantive will be on how the WHO is ineffective in making policies due to how it is politicized. And my second speaker's first substantive will be on how the democracy and accountability of individual governments. But before I move on to my substantives, rebuttals for the House today. So Proposition's case was that they will have universal standardized procedures and regulations that will be used by every single country. No, thank you. So we see that what their reasoning for this was that people make like individual governments are not standardized, and therefore they make bad policies which will affect everyone. So number one, we see that no, we don't have to have standardized policies, because standardized policies essentially means that every single country will have to have follow the same set of rules, etc. However, we see that this is completely unnecessary, because every single country will be in different states of the pandemic. We can see that this is already happening. For example, the US is in a complete state compared to Singapore. The US is like, or France is a complete different is in a completely different state compared to Hong Kong. So we see that standardized procedures will never happen, because every single country is individual and every single country is unique. And I'll elaborate this in my first substantive. So what did their second substantive told us? Essentially what their case told us as well. They're basically saying that, like, oh, if everyone has individual procedures, that means like they will never be able to end the pandemic because people will be selfish, etc. However, we see that this is not the case. Why? Because we've already gone through COVID-19. This means that if another pandemic, another global pandemic were to occur, this means that all countries will be more equipped in handling these pandemics, and therefore they will have mask regulations, safe distancing measures much quicker, because we've already gone through such things. So now moving on to my case. Our first substantive on why individual governments make the best policies. So we see the most significant thing in today's debate is that we need best policies which are effective, specific, and efficient policies that end the pandemic, right? So we see that
Point of information.
Before I continue, yes.
Yeah. So I was wondering, do you think people should hoard toilet paper during the pandemic?
Of course not. People should not hoard toilet paper during the pandemic. However, we see that during this pandemic, which was the first pandemic people mostly experienced, that those type of things happen. However, in future, when we have other global pandemics, this is not likely to occur, because people have already lived through this pandemic and they won't want to like go through such bad things again. So now moving on to my case, right? So we see that the most important thing to make such policies is, number one, they need budget, and second, they need intricate knowledge on the country's culture and the way of life. Why? Because global pandemics, despite being global, every single country has a different state and different situation. So this means that to make the best policies, studies like population studies, infrastructural studies, healthcare facilities all need to be monitored, right? And we see that WHO is simply unable to do this, because it will be such a heavy burden on them to monitor every single country and then make a standardized set of rules, because every country is unique. They have different economy, different capital, and different types of people living in the country. And so we see that, like, due to such diversity in our world, it's simply ineffective to have such standardized policies. So what this means, that individual governments are the best able to cater to these people, because number one, individual governments know that their people best, and they know their countries best, and hence will be able to get the best policies on our side, which WHO is simply unable to do. So now moving on to my second substantive on why the WHO is ineffective due to it being politicized. So again, the most significant thing in this debate is to have the best policies, right? So we see that the WHO, as I already characterized, is heavily dependent on countries' funding, like the US and China. So we see that WHO's aim is to keep the funding, which is already so small. So that means that means they are essentially biased towards these countries, and they're not a neutral organization anymore. We see this for example, Taiwan isn't part of the WHO because China and Taiwan are not allies, and China didn't want Taiwan to be part of the WHO. This already shows that WHO is not a neutral party and is already heavily politicized. So what does this mean, right? So the policies they're going to implement, although side opposition, a proposition is going to say that it's going to be standardized, this means that, like, due to it being politicized, it can never be a standardized policy for every single person. This means that the US and China, or like all these major contributors, are going to have a larger say in these policies compared to other smaller countries, etc. So what this means is that now these policies are going to be not drastic, and it's not going to be good policies at all, because what essentially is going to happen is that WHO is politicized, and hence is unable to make good policies. And for all these reasons, side opposition takes this debate.
Okay, thank you. Speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 20 seconds. Okay, it's probably been a while since you had to do a 6-minute speech. All right, you did well, okay? Okay, SAS, you have 1 minute. Okay, guys. I'd like to call the second speaker, I believe Shivan, up to continue his team's case. Shivan, please keep your own time. Listen for POIs, but I'll also time you whenever you're ready. Girls on ACJC, just speak up on the POI a little bit, okay? All right, Shivan, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so I'm going to start my speech off today with the quote. I'm going to move on to rebuttals, and I'm going to finish off by laying out our side's second substantive. So I'm going to start off with a quote from the WHO chief. Vaccine equity is not just a moral imperative, it is a strategic and economic imperative as well. And so this quote is going to be the reason that we're going to win this debate, but I'll paint that for you in my second substantive. Let's go on to some rebuttals to their points first. When introducing their case today, side opposition said that side opposition's first assertion was that this is a policy debate and who has the best policies to end the pandemic. When this debate is not actually a policy debate, it just regards which organization, the WHO or individual governments, would better address the debate. And so let's move on to their first substantive and discuss when they talked about how every country is in a unique state. Okay, yeah, every country is in a unique state, but then the WHO creates these standardized responses that cater to different countries at different stages. You know, if one country has been more affected by the pandemic, then they would perhaps categorize the kind of responses that LEDCs should take. LEDCs in this stage, LEDCs in this stage. And this is the kind of standardized response that the WHO provides. And so since the WHO is able to provide a range of responses for different countries, their first point is simply not true. Their first point simply does not matter. Now, let's move on to their second point, where they said the WHO is politicized, in which they said that it's highly dependent on the US and China. And
Point of information.
Yeah, sure.
On your side, you're saying that the WHO is able to make policies cater to LEDCs, etc. However, the WHO has no incentive because LEDCs are unable to fund the WHO.
Well, the WHO is also an organization connected to the UN, and so their sole purpose, which we will discuss in our third substantive with our third speaker, is to manage the pandemic worldwide. That is the reason the WHO was founded in the first place. And so, yes, while they might have a little bias, their key purpose, their key motive is to handle the pandemic as a whole. Now, let's discuss. And so that is why, although the WHO is politicized, their key purpose, their key motive is to handle the disease, handle the pandemic worldwide. And that is why their second substantive does not stand. Okay, so now let's move on to our third substantive today. And so the thesis of our second substantive, is that the WHO promotes more equity than individual governments. And so to walk you through this, I'm going to start off by talking about what's the most needed resource, what's the most needed good during a pandemic. Countries need PPE, they need masks, all these things, they need vaccines. And so the problem with, leaving the response in the hands of individual governments is that two things happen that disproportionately affect the poorer countries. And that is hoarding and price gauge. And so first of all, let me talk about hoarding. When we leave the response to the pandemic to individual governments, we're going to have those countries, I'll not take your point now, and we're going to have individual countries, the countries that have more money, they're going to be able to acquire more goods simply because they have more capital to do so. And we're going to see them hoarding the goods while the lower economically developed countries are unable to acquire these goods. That's hoarding. And the second problem with letting countries manage it is this thing called the price gauge. When we look at the market and everybody needs this good, everybody needs PPE, everybody needs vaccines, and all the countries are screaming, we need it too. What they're going to do is, and what they have done is, they jack up the price. And so once more, this is the only countries able to afford this are the countries with more capital, the more economically developed countries. Once more, putting the lower economically developed countries at a disadvantage. So hoarding and price gauge. Let me paint a picture for you though. This means that somebody in a more economically developed, okay, I'll take it in a second. People in countries that are more economically developed are going to be able to access vaccines, while those in lower economically developed countries are not even getting access to simple things like masks to prevent disease transmission. That's the inequality being fueled here. But before I move on to conclude my substantive, I will take a point.
On our side, I've already told you that WHO is severely underfunded. How do you expect $2 billion to be catered to 194 countries?
So the WHO would not be managing its funds. Rather, they're managing the distribution of this PPE. But I'm about to get to that right now. So basically, I'll adjust your point what I say right now. So if we leave it to individual governments, we have hoarding and price gauge. Let me give you an example of that happening right now. More than 39 million doses have been given in 49 higher income countries versus 25 doses of vaccine given in one lower income country. That's the kind of inequality that happens when you leave the response in the hands of individual governments. But I'm going to address your point right now. Let's talk about what happens when you leave it to the WHO. The WHO is going to manage these PPE, these vaccines, and they're going to distribute it in a way that's equal. Because they promote equity, they're going to distribute it in a way that's more equal than individual governments would do. And so the WHO, while they do have a little bias, they have less bias than individual countries. You see, individual countries only want to get the goods and hoard it for themselves. But the WHO, they have less bias, and they're more focused on handling it as a whole. They're more community focused. What this is going to look like is we're not going to have people in more economically developed countries getting the vaccine while people in lower economically developed countries can't even get a mask. We're not going to see that. Rather, we're going to see countries having equal access to these PPE and vaccines. And that is the world we stand for. And so for a second, was that the 6-minute mark?
Yeah, you're at 6:15. Wrap it up.
And so I'm proud to oppose.
Okay, that was
propose.
All right. Okay, speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 22 seconds. Okay, ACJC, I'll give you 1 minute. Just as a friendly reminder, you guys will be doing reply speeches. Okay, opposition will be going first. Okay, guys, I would like to thank SAS for their second speaker speech and call up ACJC's second speaker to continue her team's case. Is it Lexi?
Yes.
Okay, Lexi, let me double check my time real quick, okay, kiddo? All right, keep track of your time as well. Guys, if you're going over a little bit of 6 minutes, I'm not gonna start clapping right away. I understand that 6 minutes is a little tough after doing 8. But Lexi, whenever you're ready, okay?
Okay. So everybody can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Sorry, give me, how do I, never mind. Okay. The WHO has $2 billion for 194 countries. It's incredibly infeasible to ask them to serve every single country. So this budget is comparable to like a large university hospital, and we see there's absolutely no way that their policy is going to be feasible. But let's take them at their best when their policy is feasible. And this will be a rebuttal to their first substantive, which is followed up on. But before I do this, let me point out a contradiction. In their first substantive, they said the great thing about the WHO is that they provide a unified and a standardized approach for every single country. And then in their second speaker said they're going to cater differently to LEDCs in different stages or more economically developed countries. We think this is a contradiction because if you're pushing for the WHO because you get a unified and standardized approach, you can't say later that their approach isn't going to be standardized. Okay, so let's deal with what they said in their first speaker. And they said to our first speech. So they said that they're going to cater differently to LEDCs in certain stages. And because they're founded to manage the pandemic, their key motive is to manage the pandemic. We think they've already conceded that, in fact, the WHO is funded by different contributors in different countries. For example, China is a big funder, and the LEDCs are unable to fund the WHO. It's the incentive for the WHO to meet the needs of more economically developed countries is very obvious because they want to secure more funding and because they want to be able to continue their operation. Okay, their second substantive is on equity and on how the vaccine rollout has to be done properly. So on hoarding, we think that no, we haven't seen this happen. So for example, you have Taiwan donating masks to countries who can't afford it, or countries who don't have masks. And we think this is because they want to look good by helping others. And we think the same thing is going to happen in the future. So for example, Canada, they have 5 doses of the vaccine for every single person in their country. So we think that countries like this are going to end up giving their stocks and giving their supplies to countries that can't afford it because they want to look good and because they want to maintain their international reputation. And note that vaccines and masks are in short supply already. So either way, you have people dying. You have people unable to get vaccines. You have people unable to get PPE. And so we think that the WHO is in no position to decide who dies and who lives, right? It's completely unfeasible. We also think that the WHO will give rich countries this first anyway, because they're funded by them, and also because even if they want to have a vaccine rollout, right, they can't buy these vaccines because they don't have the money. They have to rely on generous donors. So the same thing happens in our world. We just have countries donating directly. Okay, on to my substantive on democracy and accountability. I'll talk about how democracy is so important. Okay, so we think that the vast majority of countries that we're talking about are democracies in some way, shape, or form. So this means that citizens get to pick leaders that will make important decisions on behalf of them, decisions that will drastically change their lives. Upholding and honoring this choice is so important because it's a key pillar of democracy. In contrast to government, the WHO leadership isn't elected by the citizens of the world, and a policy that calls for like voting worldwide would be extremely unrealistic. So because citizens don't get a say in who runs the WHO, they should not be mandated to have their lives restricted by the WHO. It's in fact undemocratic to impose the ideals of the WHO on people who can't hold them accountable through voting, even if they wanted to, especially for such life and death matters. So we think they're completely overreaching on their mandate if they say, actually, we want this to happen, we want these countries to get that vaccine, we want PPE to go from here to here, because it affects the lives of everyday citizens who have no say in the leadership of the WHO, have no say in the policies that the WHO is going to put in place. We think that in practice, our policy also leads to better democracy, where governments are held accountable for the decisions that they make during pandemics. So for example, Trump's handling of COVID-19 has led to many retrenched, sick, or mourning Republicans turning against him. Because citizens get to hold their governments accountable, governments are forced to do a better job than what is done by the WHO that cannot be held as accountable. Politicians face a very real threat of being voted out and being held accountable. So they make decisions very carefully because they know that their job is on the line. In contrast, because WHO leadership is not democratically elected, they are less accountable, and therefore we get better policies. We think this even happens if we're not talking about democracy. In corrupt or authoritarian regimes, they also want to maintain control and peace in their region, so they come up with better solutions than the WHO would. As we've already told you, the WHO is biased towards countries that can fund them more, and so for this reason, we think that we get better policies, especially in LEDCs. On their side, we think the governments are held even less accountable because they get to piggyback off the WHO's good work to show how well they've done, effectively reducing accountability of governments during a pandemic. On the flip side, if the WHO handles it poorly, they can be very quick to blame the WHO and not take responsibility. When these criticisms inevitably arise, we much prefer they're directed at the government, which can be held accountable through voting, than the WHO. Because blaming the WHO will cause even more tension in the international community, which is extremely harmful to international relations and to the running of the WHO. When you don't let leaders lead when it's most important, you undermine the choices of citizens who explicitly choose their leaders to lead. We think the best situation in this case is when we allow the leaders of respective countries to take charge, do what is best for their citizens and their people, because not only are they the most capable, but they have the burden to make sure that their country gets through this pandemic, that their country has less deaths. The burden is on them, not the WHO. So because we've proved to you today why we preserve democracy and accountability, why the WHO is ineffective for multiple reasons, including politicization, and why individual governments on the whole make better policies, please side with side opposition.
Okay, speaker spoke for 5 minutes and 57 seconds. Took no POIs, but no POIs were offered, were they? Okay, can you guys please help people practice? So SAS needs to ask the next speaker a POI. Okay, we're here to train. Okay, one minute, and then I'll bring the final speaker of SAS up. SAS, who's your reply speaker, by the way?
Oh, which speaker?
Who's your reply speaker?
think it's Shivan.
Okay, Shivan, you're the reply speaker.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Is 1 minute finished?
Okay. So I'd like to invite the final speaker of SAS to come up and close out his team's case. Whenever you're ready.
So let me make sure that we get this motion down right. As our second speaker has mentioned, we believe that this is a principled debate, not a policy debate. As the motion itself describes, is that this House believes, not a this House would. We want to make sure that we focus on if this were to happen, if we were to give the WHO the right to run the pandemic response, who would do better? That is our question, and that is the ground on which we are arguing. Now, even if we do argue on policy grounds, we can still win this debate, and I'll explain this later in my rebuttals. In my clashes. So I'm gonna start off with a quick rebuttal on their third substantive. They argue that they can provide accountability and also they preserve democracy. But if we are able to prove that everyday citizens or citizens of our country, the WHO can provide a better response to the pandemic than individual governments, then I don't see any reason why everyday citizens should even not want the WHO to provide a standardized response and lead the organization. Because if they're safe and their lives are being preserved, I don't see why they would want their democracy over their lives. I don't think that is even comparable in any aspect. So I'm going to be talking about two really crucial questions in this debate that have repeatedly come up and will ultimately prove who wins this debate as a whole. The first of which is what is more important, having one organization driving the pandemic response or letting each individual government steer their own pandemic plan? So I'm just going to start off by re-examining what exactly our first speaker said on the importance of having the WHO drive the pandemic response. What we've said is that information and data can be spread more quickly. Every country will be in sync. Countries will enter lockdown at the same time. Travel restrictions will be the same. This, let's just keep in mind, has nothing to do with the budget. This is all just because that everybody is synchronized and everybody is in sync. We're working together, and every country is working in sync, and not only for their own benefit. Now, what individual governments with national sovereignty, what they've said about is that they can make their own policies and they can make the best policies because they know their country the best. But what they fail to recognize is that in the WHO, they have designated sectors in every single country to organize the response to cater to their own region. Now, what I think another crucial question that needs to be considered is, what does a country need to value more, their sovereignty or the safety of their country? For example, during the Ebola crisis, countries such as Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia all allowed the WHO and the CDC, the US, to take control, and this greatly helped to curb the spread of the disease. And although Guinea, Sierra Leone, and West Africa itself as a whole isn't really that advanced, and some other countries may be more capable of handling their own country, the fact that more help equates to more lives saved still remains and still stands. Now, I want to end this on this one crucial question: is what could have happened if West Africa rejected help and did not allow the WHO and CDC to take control? We could have ended with the Ebola crisis becoming a worldwide pandemic. And because the WHO and the CDC and different global organizations were allowed to take control, we were able to stop the Ebola crisis from becoming a worldwide pandemic.
I think I heard someone with a POI. Was there a POI for someone?
It was me.
Okay, take it. Go ahead.
Hashtags like Republicans for Biden would have never occurred on your side if the Trump administration was never handled the pandemic and proved that they're incapable.
Can you repeat that again?
Hashtag Republicans for Biden and other campaigns would have never occurred if the Trump administration never handled the pandemic and proved themselves as incapable.
I think that that's a very specific case that I don't think applies to every single country. And therefore, it's just, I feel like that's too specific of a case to generalize into the whole entire world. I'm going to be going into our second clash, which is on who is going to be better at providing more equitable access to vaccines and personal protective equipment, etc. As we've said, our world gives equal access to essential medical equipment and vaccines to countries. And all brought up the fact that the WHO has a small budget. And although we've repeatedly said that this is a principal debate, I'm going to argue on the terms that this is a policy debate right here for the second. If we were to give the WHO the reins of running the pandemic response, then countries will have to give more money and more funds, because they're going to have to realize the fact that if they don't provide more money for the WHO to run their pandemic response, their own countries are going to have to suffer. We can also go on about the practicalities of how much they can provide to each of the 194 countries, but I prefer to talk about exactly what would happen if this were to occur. Rich countries may have larger populations, and like rich countries may have larger populations, which give them more doses of the vaccine. But like our second proposition has said, 39 million doses to rich countries compared to 25 doses to a poor country will never ever be justified. Now, in order for OP to win this debate, they need to prove that they can care for the entire world, and their response to this is that countries will give in the future. But this only will apply when countries feel comfortable in their own state and they feel like they're actually feeling like they're in a comfortable state. But we believe that the WHO cares about the now and the present, and they care about providing care to poor countries and countries that cannot receive or cannot adequately care for their own country immediately. Now, I'm going to end with our third substantive, really just quickly summarizing this. This is that the WHO prioritizes solving health crises over anything else. This is their sole goal, and we've already described this many times. We've already described the fact that they have some politicization, but not nearly as much as individual governments. And the fact of the matter is that the WHO makes sure that their only goal, and the reason why they were formed in the first place, is to manage health affairs. And that's why we can make sure that they're not going to be swayed by political agendas and preserving their economic stance. And we win this debate on the basis that we care for the health of the entire world, not just the wealthy. The WHO can unify the entire world and lead a global response. But what is special is that they care for everyone, so nobody is left behind, no matter what their situation is. And for that reason.
Okay. Speaker spoke for 6 minutes, 40 seconds. All right. I was going to use the mute button on you.
Oh, wow. I didn't even hear the claps. I'm so sorry.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. It's quite interesting watching these debates online. Your facial expressions, all of you guys, like shock. Like you can watch the video later on and you can see. Okay. 1 minute, ACJC. First speaker from ACJC has the best facial expressions when she doesn't like something she's hearing. How do I say your name?
Faiza.
Faiza. Yeah, you're very animated, Faiza. Okay. So I'd like to have the third speaker of ACJC come up and finish her team's case whenever you're ready.
This is a mic test. If you cannot hear me, please say so. If not, I'll be starting my speech shortly.
You are good. Okay.
I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 clashes for the House today. Firstly, on the politicization of the WHO, whether this exists and why it's important. Secondly, on the WHO and individual governments' ability to form policies, which side is better able to form policies to eradicate the pandemic. And third clash is on whether democracy is important and how it impacts this debate. So first clash on politicization of the WHO and whether it will exist, right? First and foremost, we would like to clarify that this in fact is a policy debate, and the reason for this is because side proposition's very policy or their preferred approach will affect how their countries receive aid, right? We think that their resolutions will become watered down, and we will prove to you why this is so important in our second clash. But before that, proposition's first substantive told us that they prefer a unified and standardized approach, right? But we told you how this is not feasible because every country is different and they have different economic statuses, and they are unable to manage they are unable to manage a standardized approach. Our second substantive told you how the WHO will be politicized, right? And let me just extend on this and show you what this actually means, right? The WHO relies on funders, and this means that they have selective pressure from specific countries to carry out their will, right? Which means that the WHO will be hesitant to make the right decisions because at the back of their minds, they will have to keep all these funders in mind, right? You cannot just tell us that the WHO is just going to increase the amount of funding that it receives because LADCs simply cannot provide this much funding. This means that on their side, the LADCs lose out because of this politicization, right? The LADCs, they cannot provide as much money, therefore they'll be at a loss. This means that on their side, they actually don't have a unified standardized approach, and instead they actually make LADCs they are at a loss. Our second clash deals with whether the WHO or individual governments are able to make the best policies to deal with the pandemic, right? So their prop case told us that they will have countries do whatever they want. They told us that the WHO will instruct everyone to use the same method in dealing with the pandemic, right? Let me further deal with this and tell you how, right, having specialized policies is so much better because the WHO is not empowered to make decisions that are beyond, for example, the economy of a specific country, their cultures, their demographics. The WHO simply does not have access to this information, and they do not have the funds to do so. Their one-size-fits-all policies does not work because they cannot take into account the economy of different countries. Yes, I'll take the point.
So you said that the WHO won't be able to cater because they don't have the necessary information, but we've discussed that if we were to give the WHO the reins, that they would be given information for every country, and they also sectors in every country. How do you respond to that?
We think that the WHO, even though given this information, is unable to coordinate so many different policies, right? There's hundreds of countries in the world. The WHO doesn't have the time, the money, or the manpower to coordinate different responses to each specific country. Some countries will inevitably be shoved into a category that does not even fit them well, and this will disadvantage them in terms of the resolution that the WHO is handing out, right? The second substantive talks about equity and how everyone will handle the pandemic the same, and this is allows the WHO to distribute resources equally. This clashes with our first substantive on how we talked about individual governments making the best policies. They're better able to provide these materials and manufacture these resources for their individual countries, right? We want to focus on LADCs in this clash, and I will extend it by showing you how, as I've mentioned earlier, that resolutions will become watered down on their side, right? Because there's a competing interest, and on their side, we assume that they will need a majority vote to pass resolutions, and given that the WHO is dominated by powerful countries which they have not challenged this characterization, so we assume that this characterization still stands. This means that powerful countries are going to be sending diplomats instead of experts instead of medical experts in order to push for whatever policy they want to, and they'll also demand a veto power, for example, what has happened in the UNSC. This means that resolutions are not going to be passed, or they're going to be watered down in order to please these large, powerful countries, and the WHO is unable to lead all the countries. This is why LADCs are at a loss, because they don't have the manpower or these diplomats in order to send into the WHO, which means that they're unable to cope well with the crisis because they are unable to input their opinion. Our third clash on whether democracy is important in today's debate, right? I want to, this deals with their third substantive and our third substantive, right? We told you that democracy and accountability is important, and they told us that saving lives is more important than democracy. We'll show you why, right? In the long term, when we actually prioritize democracy, we actually save more lives, right? When we allow governments to do their own thing, democracy is upheld and corrupt governments are going to be identified. If a country is not helping their citizens, or if they're not providing enough supplies, this means this is very obvious to the world because of the statistics that will show. And this means that corrupt governments are going to be held accountable by their fellow countries, because they're going to be putting political pressure on these corrupt governments through, for example, economic sanctions or political sanctions that the WHO is unable to do. This means that the democracy is upheld because these corrupt governments are going to be either voted out, or they will start some reforms in order to better their policy. And this is why democracy is so important, because in the long run, we are able to solve these corrupt governments and better help the healthcare system as a whole. I'm so proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you very much. Speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 25 seconds. We're gonna take a 2-minute break before I hear the replies. And once again, replies will be 3 minutes. I will be right back. I'm gonna go get some water, okay, guys?
Wait, Mr. K?
Yes?
I was gonna ask, do you think that, do you want us to ask our POI even if time is over, like just for the sake of like?
Yeah, we should have talked about that ahead of time though. So no.
Okay, then, okay, yeah.
Okay, give me a second. I'll be right back, and then opposition, you guys will be giving a reply, okay?
Why didn't you say that earlier?
Okay, guys, let's do this. All right, so I'd like to invite the reply speaker for ACJC up. Remember, we'll go 3 minutes. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, cool. Can you hear me? Oh, can you hear me like this? Okay.
Lexi, we can hear you.
Great.
All right, good luck. You're gonna do well. Let's go.
Okay. 94 million infected, 194 countries involved, and only $2 billion of WHO funding to go around. It's imperative that we let governments lead responses so that we can save countless lives. We win this debate because we have better solutions to the pandemic. So 4 main reasons why we win. Firstly, we win because we proved to you why the WHO is not a neutral organization. We told you in our second substantive that the WHO is politicized. So for example, it didn't announce that COVID was human-to-human transmission until 21 January, and it could have saved multiple lives if they've done this earlier. But no, they didn't want to anger China because China gives them a lot of funding. Their second sub was on equity and how the WHO will be equal and promote equity, and they'll be community focused. But we think they can't say that this will happen, as well as admitting that funding comes from different benefactors, because the incentive for the WHO to pander to big countries is obvious. Second reason why we won. We win because we show you why individual specific policies are better than standardized policies. And they've been inconsistent on their stance. In their first speaker, they said everything will be the same. In their second, they said they'll tailor it to LEDCs and stuff. And on both characterizations we win. But then in their third speak up, we said that they said in a POI that they'll give the WHO funding and info and studies of culture will be provided. And this is super inconsistent. So let's tell you why in both cases we win. Firstly, because we've told you that blanket policies don't work. Let's illustrate what their world looks like. In their best case scenario, they impose lockdowns worldwide, stop travel, don't let COVID leave China. But this is incredibly unfeasible because they don't dare to take such drastic measures that anger big countries. If this happened, it would still be a bad move because you don't need countries like New Zealand to lock down in January, for example, because things aren't so bad for them yet. So we think that blanket policies don't work because every country is in a different stage as COVID arrives at their shores, and they are best equipped to deal with it as it happens. Then we think that tailored policies by the WHO don't work because they can't tailor it for everybody. And in our first hub, we showed you how the governments know their countries best. They know the culture, they know the demographics, they know the economy, and they know how to best resolve this solution. In their third sub, they said that the WHO's only concern is pandemic, so they'll be better. But we showed you that actually it's better that governments who need to balance the economy, the pandemic, and standards of living make decisions because they do so in context, which is better for people's lives. Thirdly, we win because we proved that we preserve people's choice and have better democracy. Our substantive on democracy and accountability wasn't dealt with properly, but we think that we need democracy because we want people to be held accountable. And if we argue on the principle as they want us to, we win because we preserve democracy. Fourth, we win because we help LEDCs better, like with masks and vaccines. We let the government tailor solutions to them and focus on them wholeheartedly, which is infinitely better than the WHO pushing them aside and providing a solution that may not fit them. Lastly, we win this debate because we have better facial expressions. So in conclusion, we win this debate because we proved to you why the WHO is not a neutral organization. They can't take care for everybody. We showed to you why our policies are better, and we showed to you how we preserve people's choice. On all fronts of this debate, please side with side opposition.
All right, good job. I told you you're going to do a good job. Look at that smile on your face. It's good. All right. Well, I already know what team won based on that last comment, so you crushed it. No, of course I'm not gonna. All right.
Bias much? I thought you were gonna be biased towards us.
No, I don't like you guys.
Pain.
Always bugging me, asking me questions. Jeez, get away from me, kid.
That's only Shivan.
All right, that's true. All right. Speaking of kids, I have a couple kids waiting for me to go outside and play with them. My daughter. So Shivan, are you giving the speech? Reply speech?
Yeah.
Okay, whenever you're ready, Shivan.
Okay, let me just get my timer real quick. Before I start, let's look at one thing that opposition, one concept they became very fond of near the end of, the debate. One thing that they started talking to us about. It's about holding countries accountable. So they were saying that by when we put when we take the response out of the hands of the WHO, countries will be held responsible if they don't take the right decisions. And so, well, if that is true, then how come the United States, even with all the pressure, has still not undergone lockdown? With all the pressure from outside states, and here they are still not locked down. The point is that this accountability of countries is only going to work for the weaker countries. The ones who can't fight back, the ones who don't have all the power to say no, we're going to continue doing what we're doing. The only countries that can do this are, countries like America, like I just told you guys. It's the more economically developed countries. And so one of the biggest questions in this debate is who better addresses the LEDCs, which they discussed as well. And so this is the first stance on which we win, but let me paint the worlds for you. So in their world, you have, individual countries managing their own, managing it for themselves. Okay, sorry. A second question is also what we value more, democracy or saving lives. And so, so the first paradigm is in which, the individual countries are managing the diseases internally. They're doing it by themselves. So, well, when they're managing the disease by themselves, democracy exists. They can choose not to lock down, things like this. But the problem with that is, it comes down to the question of, well, they're saying people will value democracy more than, having their lives saved. And clearly, I hope you stand for this too, is that they would obviously value their life more. And so this is why our paradigm in which the WHO controls things is better, because the WHO would enforce restrictions in which restrictions in which people in the countries would be protected. They would enforce restrictions that are universal and do not discriminate between LEDCs and MEDCs. They're gonna propose solutions, and so in this paradigm, democracy is valued less than the saving lives, and so that is what we stand for. So yeah, I'm proud to propose.
Okay. Speaker spoke for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Shivan, how many reply speeches have you given in your life?
I think this was like my first reply speech.
All right. Yes. Good job. All right. You got one reply speech down. Not as good as Lexi's. Okay. All right. So, hey guys, it was really nice having you guys online and running a debate. I know it kind of makes training a lot more interesting if you're debating other people rather than the same faces all the time, no matter how many faces they're making in the screen. So listen, I'm going to record this. Excuse me. I'll send you guys the recording. From what I understand, Sam wanted the girls to maybe discuss the debate afterwards. I don't know if you guys have a plan to do that. Okay. I'll talk to Sam, but I think one question for me, actually two questions in this debate that I don't know if I could answer to help you guys out. Generally, I kind of was looking at this as more of a principle motion. Obviously, there's some practical stuff, but I did think that ACJC, it would have been nice what if you gave the WHO credit? Like they can do all this. It still doesn't answer the question why a country could have an even better standard. You know, like let's say WHO can be the floor. Like there's a standard minimal way that we can control the virus. I couldn't answer off the top of my head right now why a country like Singapore, if they have their game together and they can do it, why can't they go one better? Why would they have to agree to a watered down universal sort of policy that the WHO might implement in terms of handling the pandemic? Okay. So I was just that was one question that I had. And then the other one is that we did get into pragmatics. And so I don't know if prop fiat comes into that at all. And just assuming like, yeah, they can do it. Now in principle, whether or not they should. Do we want to centralize or do we want to break up the centralization and have multiple, and like you guys said, blanket policy, multiple approaches in this? Because with multiple approaches, you can still revert back to the WHO and give them your information and say, hey, here's what we're learning. We don't need to follow you, but you can use our scientists, our data, our experiences to maybe help other countries. So that was one thing I was thinking, because I still think that's more on a principle level, whether we need everything concentrated in the hands of one organization or dispersed. And then the other one is, why would countries who really have their pandemic response together, why must they actually follow the WHO if they're actually above and beyond what maybe a minimal standard that the WHO is saying? Okay, so those are a couple questions. I can talk to Sam, but you might want to bring that up too. I'm a little unclear whether that would be good strategically for you guys. Okay, SAS, I will talk to you guys next time I see you, or I'll see you in school, and then we can talk more about the debate. Okay, maybe a little virtual handshake, everyone. Okay. Have a great night, guys. Thank you. Bye, ACJC. Cheers.
Thank you for the debate.
You bet. Bye, guys.
Do we leave?
Yeah, you guys can leave.